Welcome back to the Fish Locker Workshop. I'm going to take a little bit of time now to talk about the basics of anchoring your boat, to fish from really. The reason being is I've been asked by a couple of folks how I do it and how I would recommend doing it. A lot of these things are variables. Say for instance, it depends on the size of your boat, it depends on the depth of your water that you're in, it depends on the wind or the tide, and I'll explain briefly, but this is just the basics, and this is how I've found it. Now, the standard, as it was explained to me when I first started, was if you're using just rope, you need 3 times the depth of water. So as I'll show you here, if you can imagine, this is your boat. Obviously, this is the surface, this is the sea, this is the seabed. If this here is 30 feet, you should put out around 90 feet. The reason being is because when you put the anchor down, it doesn't just go straight down. As the tide runs, your anchor will end up sitting like that. If you have any chain attached to your anchor, then you don't need to use 3 times the depth. Get away with 2 times the depth. If you're using all chain, probably 1.5 times the depth. The reason being is instead of your rope going straight to your anchor, the chain holds more of it on the seabed. So you've actually got more weight along the bottom. This also, if your boat is rising up and down on, say, swell, this is where it rises up and down. It doesn't dislodge your anchor. If you just anchored up, say like this, all that would happen there is as your boat moves, it just drags the anchor. And as you go up and down on swell, it just lifts your anchor up and down. I always carry 2 types of anchor on board the boat. Not only for the 2 different areas of ground, rough ground and soft ground, but because it's safer to have a redundancy. So if say for instance, if my engine drops off and I can't get it started and I'm drifting towards somewhere, I just want to chuck an anchor out. If for some reason I lose that anchor, I need another one. Also, like I say, most of my fishing is only in 50 feet of water. Sometimes there are areas that are a bit deeper, but I'll usually have, say for instance with this, I'll have 6 feet of chain, and then I have 3 bundles of 25 feet of rope. The same with my soft ground anchor. I have a 2 kilo anchor, I have 15 feet of chain, and then I have 2 bundles of 40 feet of rope. I have far more rope than I should ever need, but it's always better to have more than you need than need some and not have it. This anchor is pretty much looks after itself. All you do is drop it down, and as you start to drift, this will dig into the sand, dig into the mud. And then generally when fishing in the mud, when you come to pulling your anchor, all you have to do is give it a little bit of extra elbow grease and it pulls out of the mud. One that requires a little bit more strategy is when you're fishing in really rough stuff, like really hard ground in a reef, or for that I use one of these anchors. But as you may notice, what I've done is instead of attaching to this end, I have a shackle to this end, and then I have cable tied it to here. So the anchor will work standard, but if it ever becomes stuck in the ground like this, all that happens is as you pull, I mean usually all I do is I'll show you here. I'll be sat at anchor in rough ground like that. If I can't get my anchor out, I just start pulling it in until you end up where you are directly above where you snagged. And then all I do is I'll either take a bite around the cleat or just to hold it and brace it. And generally the buoyancy of the boat over a swell or over any type of wave will usually break this. Now all it does is it breaks out and then your anchor collapses. So it lifts your anchor out that way. That saves you from losing your anchor. Now you can use a cable tie. I've also used 50-pound line, but just a breakaway to get your anchor out. So it holds like this until it gets stuck. Extra bit of pull breaks it out and it lifts your anchor out backwards. If you're coming up to a mark, say for instance like a piece of wreck or a piece of reef, and you want to anchor to fish into it, if you're fishing in shallow water you can pretty much anchor up on top of it and you are inside the mark. But say for instance if you're fishing in something that's excess of 40-50 feet of water, what I will generally do is I will steam up to the mark where I'm fishing. Say for instance if I want to fish this mark here is a wreck, say for instance, I will steam up tide of it. Say for instance if your wind is going in this direction and your tide is going in this direction, I will drift up tide, I will steam up tide, kill the engine, just to see which way the boat will drift. Because although the tide will go this way, so your lines will go in that direction, because of the wind you might drift in that direction. So if I was going to anchor on that mark, if I drop my anchor here, my boat might end up there. In which case I would finish my drift to find out in which direction I would end up going, and then you would steam upwards of where that mark is, so that when you anchor up you can fish directly back onto it. In my local area you can be fishing one moment and you're in 30 feet, and then if you end up in the middle of the channel you will end up in 90 feet. I was asked maybe a week ago by a young lad who doesn't have a boat but he's looking at renting one, and he said the boat only comes with 40-50 feet of rope, and I would like to be able to fish in the deeper areas to be able to try and catch some bullhuss or some thornback rays. Now how can I go about doing this? Can I tie off to a mooring buoy, say for instance? The way that I do it, and as long as you have an understanding of which way the tide and which way the wind are running, you don't necessarily need to anchor up in the deepest parts to be able to fish in the deepest parts. So for instance, this is a very crude drawing of the area we're talking about, and we have a big area of shelf and then we have a large area of channel, and the tide always runs in this direction and it runs out in this direction. So when it floods it goes this way, and when it ebbs it goes that way. So if there was no wind, say for instance on one day, and you were fishing the flood tide, if I wanted to fish in the channel, all I would do was I would try and anchor up in the 30 feet of water, let out my 70 feet of rope. You would end up where your boat, your anchor might be in 30 feet of water, but your boat ends up in 60 feet of water. And if you drop your line off the back, your line ends up in 90 feet of water. The same way that if the tide's ebbing, all I would do would you try and stick your anchor into the top of the drop off, and as the tide's ebbing off you will end up with your boat like that, fishing into the deeper water. Take into account some wind. Say for instance if we're having northeasterly, or you're having a west, easier one to talk about, a westerly. So having a westerly going straight across in this direction. All you would do there then is, like I said before, you would get to the edge of where you want to anchor up, kill the engine, see in which direction you're going to drift. So with an ebbing tide and a westerly wind you would probably end up drifting in this type of a direction. In which case all you would do was you would circle back round, drop your anchor here, put your 70 feet of rope out, and you'd end up fishing in the deeper area. All you have to do is understand which way, what the state of tide's at, so which way the tide's running, and what the weather's doing. To better illustrate my point, I'll show you with a cross-section view. Say for instance, if this is your 30 feet and here is your 90 feet. This is where you want to be fishing. All you would need to do is when you get to the edge of your drop off, try and drop your anchor here, let out your chain, let out your rope, let out your 70 odd feet, and your boat might end up in 60 feet. Now, you've only let out 60 feet of rope, but you're in 60 feet of water. And when you drop your lines off the back, your lines are never going to go straight up and down. Your lines will end up, if that makes sense. There we are. These are the basics as I know them. They don't really change. If you are anchoring up, use 2 times, 3 times the depth of water with anchor rope. If you're using a little bit of chain, you can get away with a bit less. My boats, well, both my boats, I had a 14-foot Orkney and I've got a 16-foot Orkney, and I only use a 2 kilo anchor, 5 feet of chain, and I have 75 feet of rope that anchors me fine in rough ground of 40, 50, 60 foot deep. And for soft ground, again, I have a 2 kilo anchor, but a soft ground anchor with 15 feet of chain and 70, 80 feet of rope. And that's always anchored me fine. If you find that if you put the anchor over the side and you've given 2 times the depth of water and it drags, let out a little bit more rope. If you're finding that you are anchored up and your boat is swinging an awful lot, now you won't be able to stop that if you've got wind against tide and you've got a little light boat, but occasionally bringing in a little bit of rope can help. It's not an exact science, but these are the basics as I see them. I hope this helped. If you want to ask any questions, give me a comment.